This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about technology. How do you use it in your fiction without it becoming obsolete by the time your book is published? How do you use it in your fiction effectively so that it doesn't too easily solve all of your hero's problems with the tap of a screen? Does it apply to every genre? Or is this just a sci-fi/contemporary problem? Do you write a lot of technology into your stories, either of you, and how aware are you of its role?
Well, as a science fiction author, yes.
Right.
and you have to be pretty aware of its role in it. And definitely, as you hinted at, the limitations, because otherwise the reader might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, if they can just teleport, why don't they just teleport themselves out of the jail? I don't understand. How does that... How is that working? So you have to then invent either a force field or a null field, or you've got to have some limitation that you've thought of somewhere around the line to continue to have the complications working without necessarily having to then sit down and explain tech to the reader, or have that awkward, one character turning to another. Well, Bob, there's a force field around these cells.
Yes.
They would just know that. Yeah. But I think also it applies to even contemporary romance, for example, where you've got, say, these teen stories where the conflict all comes around social media, or text chats. There's something that goes wrong. What's that going to look like in 10 years? Are people going to be reading that in 10 years and going, what is this? I don't get it. Why was that why don't they just pick up the phone and talk? Why don't they just flip down their glasses and go live? I don't get that.
Yes.
And I've read stories with heads-up displays where they've got all this information at their fingertips or in front of their eyes, but then something so simple is evading them, and you think, why? I don't understand. You've got the universe at your fingertips. So I think it is key to think about it, whether... it's obvious when you go back to, say, medieval fantasy type settings. Everyone knows that you've got to set the rules of your magic, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. But every moment in life has its own magic, and just because we call it technology, as who was it? Was it Arthur C. Clarke or Einstein or someone says, technology sufficiently advanced seems like magic to those who have never seen it before.
Yes.
So I do think it plays a part. Even in our current modern day scenario, if you're writing contemporary fiction that's taking place in 2021, are you going to include a pandemic? It's a big decision, Well, maybe I need it for the sake of my story. Maybe I don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
don't
if I
set
don't
it in
need
this
it, don't set it then.
problematic year. Yeah. As you're talking about these genre considerations, you had me thinking about forward thinking, trying to envision what technology will be like in the future if you're setting your story in the future, or, picking a timeline that works for your story without technology getting in the way. Like, would you set your story in 2020 or 2021, or just pick a different year, avoid...
Or, make it an alternate reality. Just get rid of it. Just pretend it didn't exist. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there's a Ray Bradbury short story, The Pedestrian, where the protagonist, the pedestrian, is out walking at night and everybody else is at home glued to their TVs, and a cop car pulls up and starts questioning him. Why is he out here? What is he doing? It's so suspicious not being in front of your TV at night. And this voice questioning him is coming through a speaker. Nobody actually gets out of the car to talk to him. So Bradbury got the idea of the driverless car, and I'm not sure if there was a person monitoring him or if this was supposed to be an artificial intelligence in the car itself, but in the narrative he describes the sound of punch cards flipping as they run the car, right? Because in the 50s, computers ran punch cards, and I was like, wow, he's like so close with the driverless car and so far away with the punch cards.
Right, but that's an example of, like, that doesn't get in the way of the story.
No,
right?
it doesn't.
He's
right.
not relying on that part of it to be the hinge of the story. And I think that's where, if you use technology as a crutch like that, it becomes a little bit harder, right? So if it's about the fact that it's a computer-driven car, sure, but it's not about that. It's about the pedestrian not interacting with another human being. He's the only one out on the road, right? So that's what the story is intrinsically about, and we understand that on a gut level, which is, I think, why, if you're talking about, like, contemporary romance with text messages and social media, that's just communication, right? So if you don't allow the technology to get in the way of the fact that it's communication, the reader's still going to get it, get involved in it, feel it, understand it 20, 30 years from now. It doesn't matter, right? It's if it becomes too much the point rather than what is it actually trying to convey, right? Which I would imagine is the same in science fiction, right, Robert? Like, as you're getting this technology, you can't let the technology be the point unless maybe you're super, super hard sci-fi, question mark?
Yeah, I think, sometimes you have to get it right because of whatever the premise is. So, and even not just sci-fi, say it's forensic police procedural or something like that, then the science and the current of the setting is going to make some difference to how the plot turns. Right. And it could be the key to we've all read those stories where the breakthrough in the science is the key, but that's different. That might be an exception. So yeah, I think you're right, Kathryn. You're at the end of the day, you're only using this for characters to interact or to place a character in a situation. So as long as you're aware of that, because I was thinking, going back to, say, historical drama or even westerns, we know why they couldn't, go across country in mere days, because they only rode horses. We know that guns only had 6 bullets. We know that rifles sometimes jammed. We know that they weren't necessarily that accurate. So a lot of those things would play into the story, but they weren't the story. So I think that's really what you're saying. And I suppose if you are writing something around the technology of the time as the central pivot, then you just have to be prepared what it's going to date. And when people read it, then they're going to have to maybe make some sense of it. So if you know that it's still going to be read in the future, you have to drip feed somehow why this was important or why this was happening. I'm thinking of a short story I read by Peter Cordran, which was about an academic who had put forward a theory that aliens were already on Earth or close to interacting with Earth, because he'd discovered a particular Twitter account that was only following real scientists, and then had followed all of the trails down all of the other paths. And because of the patterns of investigation, he put together this hypothesis that this was an alien entity trying to understand the social mores of humans. And it's a brilliant premise. And probably could be timeless if it was explained. It was only a short story, so he didn't have a lot of time. It was, a vignette, really. But clever use of technology and the technology of the day to bring in a big concept. And there were all sorts of things supporting it science-wise, like the latency of the reactions and retweets were always to a specific time that put these aliens somewhere just outside Jupiter. It was really fascinating. It was just extraordinary.
Yeah, I think that timelessness versus timeliness, kind of being frozen in a moment of time, is worth considering when we're writing any kind of technology into our stories. The Bradbury piece probably wouldn't be around, probably wouldn't be known if it wasn't Bradbury, because it is a short story. And when I read about the punch cards, I did get pulled out of the story to go, isn't that funny?
Yes.
Ha ha ha, right? Yeah. Isn't that cute or something? Especially because it was in such sharp juxtaposition to the driverless car. And Robert, you were talking earlier about people writing romance today and having all of this communication communication by text message, which on the one hand, as Kathryn said, it's communication and that is timeless. But, you pointed out people might think, why don't they just do this thing instead? And I was thinking, and with all of the abbreves that people use and the way language evolves, some of that might not communicate anymore. People might not understand what all of those abbreviations mean if technology shifts our means of communication significantly enough that doesn't make sense anymore if it all goes verbal or something instead of thumb typing, which, doesn't matter for every story. But if you are thinking about the future, or if you are crafting something that you really want to be around for more than a few years, more than 10 years, it's worth considering.
Right. Well, and honestly, you're going to be so generationally specific if you're using some of those text message abbreviations and things even now, because I can't even read half of that stuff sometimes. And it's like,
yes,
I am not that old. I don't think.
No, you are not.
But it's just like one of those things, you got to be a little more universal. So even if you're using text messages, I would suggest just use regular English and edit it for grammar, right? Even if your high school student might use an abbreviation in this story, just
adapt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because your wider audience may not understand it. Because it's so super culturally specific. And a lot of these are even regional specific or school specific, it's just everybody has their own kind of subset of language and abbreviations right now. So yeah, again, kind of falls in line with the technology thing. If you're going to be that specific, you might have to explain more than you would if you just let it be a little more broad.
And we're in such a transparent, for your layperson anyway, society, that it's very difficult to get away with things now. So, villains have to get away with stuff. But when you've got CCTV and you've got biometrics and you've got, digital trails for everything, you've got GPS locations for cell phones. You have to think your way around these things now if you're writing, say, a thriller, for example, or don't set it in modern day, but or find a different premise that everyone's. Is there a new norm that comes about because of that?
There is, absolutely. And have either of you watched the Wachowski sisters Sense8?
No.
It's very good, very good. And it's one of those 8 protagonists, so a collective protagonist group, and of course every protagonist brings a different skill set, and one of them is a hacker who's got a girlfriend who's pretty tech savvy, and then a friend who comes into the storyline who's a super hacker, the Uber hacker. So they are doing things like changing traffic lights and urban infrastructure during a chase scene in another country to help out their fellow protagonists. So they really use the tech to the advantage of their characters, but then, tech isn't used against them in the same way, right? It is, but it isn't. So there's still some suspension of disbelief, but it's fun. And it was fresh to see the heroes who are the underdogs, who are on the outside of all of the infrastructure and all of the, powers that be, being able to use tech to their advantage.
Yeah. Like Minority Report or some of the later Mission Impossibles and things like that, where you see the technology being used to track people or to find people or, things like that. So yeah, finding your way around that. How are they actually tracking? What can I change about my character in order to make them unrecognizable? Things like that. Yeah.
Are you ready to take your storycraft to the next level? StoryWorks Fiction Online School has courses available right now, from micro courses on character traits to master level workshops on plot and building characters. There are also live workshops with your instructor in the classroom with you every week, guiding your progress and workshopping your manuscripts along the way. All students enrolled in StoryWorks Fiction, whether active in a class or not, can take advantage of the monthly free live Q&A calls with Alida. Check out storyworksfiction.com today and take your storycraft to the next level.
I suppose really, I mean, we sort of posed this maybe as a so-called difficult question, but reality is that there's plenty of masterpieces around that have done it quite well and are still watchable. You just, you work your way around it, and we're still capable of reading, Shakespeare or Jane Austen, or and are okay with the technology of the time. So it's I think comes down to that very basic thing that you said, Kathryn, which is it's not the centerpiece. It's a device that causes whatever issues between people, and so as long as you don't try and make it the centerpiece, or if you are, then you're deliberately constructing a hard science type story or a era based story that relies on that particular technology. But you're still people and characters. Yeah,
right.
It gives you that opportunity to be so creative, and I think some of our favorite things maybe will come out of that creativity. Like I'm thinking like Arrival, some of these other really stories I've really enjoyed, that they take that technology and they say, okay, like here it is, now let's play with it, and that's kind of fun. It's just another tool that you get to play with.
I've tried to find, and I don't know, I'm sure if now that the internet's what it is, I could probably find it again, but for years there was a really great story that I loved there, where something happened that shifted the fabric of reality, and it stopped combustion happening past a certain speed. So engines didn't work, guns didn't work, but things that were slow moving would work. So you could stab someone really slowly, for example, but you can shoot them.
Ouch.
Fascinating. It's a fascinating concept. Yeah, ouch indeed. But of course, all of a sudden it changes all these things that people took completely for granted. So it's like an apocalyptic event, but with a unique twist on it. So I've always really liked ideas like that, where you take the things that we take technologically or socially for granted. We're surrounded by social media, and it both empowers us and drives us nuts in our current day. But what would happen if we did something to that and twisted it into the future? And,
but even in
maybe you had to be privileged to be plugged into a certain network, but if you were poor, you couldn't, and then that disadvantaged you. And
Ready Player One.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Even in non-genre fiction, though, we need to be aware of technology. If you're writing a contemporary novel, just straight up contemporary fiction, how is technology being used by your characters in your story, and how is it going to affect them? Because you want that sense of reality, that verisimilitude, right? If it's contemporary and it's what your readers are using and are used to, but you also don't want it to get in the way. Does your protagonist have to discover emails or text messages that weren't meant to be discovered, or does the parental tracking app on your YA protagonist's phone, how is this going to affect your story? And how can you use it effectively so that it's a tool you're consciously shaping?
Yeah, it's an asset, not a liability, right?
Right.
You don't want to ignore it and then have it turn around and bite you. You want to be in charge of that technology.
Right.
Yeah, so I suppose if the use of the technology would spoil the conflict or the complication, then you've got to then think about making it obvious to the reader why they wouldn't use it, or why they would use it in a particular way, but not bending over backwards to explain it. It's tricky, isn't it? You sort of I guess we do it already. We must do it already. It's just that by making us conscious of the ever-changing need, where I suppose we're all used to stories where those things weren't around, and so it made sense that you could have a countdown clock or a race against time because communication was difficult. But nowadays we know communication is not at all difficult. Mm-hmm. So we've got to introduce a different way, a different reason for having a countdown or a race against time, or make it clear that, a reason that makes sense.
Right.
I think you have to take it into account. I don't think you can't.
Right, you do. Absolutely. And it changes the way we interact with strangers as well. You know, I used to, before cell phones were prevalent, not before they existed, but before they were so commonplace, if I got a flat tire cycling, I would have 3 or 4 people stop and ask if I needed help before I had my tire changed. So in a very short amount of time, I'd have lots of offers for help. And now, you know, flat tire on the car, flat tire on the bike, you are just invisible. Nobody cares because they assume if you need help, you've got a phone in your pocket. Yeah. Help is already on the way. You know, and I had a flat tire on my car once. I drove to a lake and walked my dog around it, came back, and I didn't have my phone with me. I had forgotten, just kind of like heading out the door for a dog walk. I had forgotten my phone. So I'm like standing there looking, who's approachable, whose attention can I get, who can I talk to, who's gonna, like, you know, so this...
Who's not a serial killer.
Right. So this nice family, you know, walked me to their house and let me use a phone because they didn't like actually have a phone on them because they lived there and we're just walking around the lake. So it changes our perceptions of the world and the way we interact with each other when we're out and about in ways that you might not think about if you just take it for granted that, you know, this is how it is.
Well, and you think about, like, if I saw somebody who asked to borrow my cell phone right now, I would think very hard about handing that over and think about what you've got on that cell phone, right? Yeah. And if you're unlocking it for them to use and like all these things that you can use as complications, it's not just something that your protagonist could use to call for help in the final battle, right? That, oh no, they could have just called for help because they have a cell phone. Yeah, but it's all these other things too.
Right.
So. And then maybe your phone's gone dead because it always made me laugh. Actually, we was talking about this movie on the other episode about the comet striking the Earth, and then they had their cell phone. Now they did have cell phones having trouble getting service because infrastructure was getting smashed. So that's good. But they seem to have these batteries that just lasted forever. Everyone knows that doesn't happen. You know, it's especially if it's searching for service. You know, it's going to carry on. And then, so supposing your phone died and they had no battery. So everyone's got them. So you ask to borrow someone. They're very generous. So yeah, sure, go ahead. There's probably only a smattering of numbers now that I would actually remember.
Yep.
Because they're just programmed in, you know, and so the only ones I remember are the ones before we had them programmed in.
Yes.
That I used to have to type in. So you know, if you get hold of Rod. He's a close friend, but I wouldn't know his number off the top of my head.
Right.
Totally.
Yes. And there aren't white pages anymore either. You try Googling somebody, and it's like, oh, well, if you sign up and pay us money, we'll show you a public record for this person. It's like, oh,
yeah.
Yes.
I'll go to the internet, but supposing there's no internet.
Right?
So I think, you know, there's lots of ways you can complicate, obviously, but...
Cell phone goes dead and all of a sudden you don't even have any money because all your entire wallet's on your phone.
Yes. Yep.
Or ID.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Yeah. So in other words, we're all way too reliant on those little back pocket computers. All right, there's a story in there, people. There's your writing prompt for the week.
Look, you know, Face ID, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So and fingerprinting. I get punched
in the face. What happens?
There you go.
Can I use my phone? Okay, you can put the code in, right? But, you know, still.
Well, not if you
Still.
get punched in the face and your hands are chopped off.
Oh, thanks.
And now you have amnesia because you have a concussion and you can't remember what year it is.
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't remember that one phone number that's locked in your memory from 20 years ago.
The only one.
That's right. And all the CCTV around the neighbourhood has been disabled because they were sick and tired of the government spying on them.
That's right.
Yes.
Conspiracy theorists.
There we go. All right.
So there's always a way around it. You've just got to find the masterwork that's managed to do it. I mean, you mentioned Minority Report. I mean, that's actually quite an old movie now, really, but would still work.
Mm-hmm.
Because it uses a very human concept that you can be mentally capable of committing a crime, and therefore you should be punished in advance for that.
Wow. Weird. I think a good takeaway for everybody is that because of how technology is so pervasive in our lives today, even if you aren't writing science fiction or fantasy, you still need to set up your rules for technology. How are your characters using it? How prevalent is it going to be in your story? What kind of trouble can it create if you do use it? What issues form around it? Is it security? Is it trust? And you could choose to have no technology, set a different year, or just ignore it, but you kind of have to make a choice just because we live with so much of it right now.
Yeah, I think so, but particularly when it comes to problem solving. And in any story, the protagonist is going to have problems to solve. And sometimes that's as simple for us these days as picking up a phone. So if it shouldn't be that simple for the protagonist, then you have to find a way around it. But if it is that simple, then you've then got to take the information they get as not being complete enough, or they've got to seek out other people or something, because we all know that whilst everything on the internet is completely and utterly accurate and true, sometimes you do need the help of a person.
Yes.
That's right.
Excellent. Any other thoughts?
No, it's interesting though, very interesting.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.